University of Galway, where we proudly hold the archive of John McGahern, a truly special collection of John's manuscripts, his writings, drafts, photos, letters, and many more records from a career and life in writing, including indeed many early drafts and later transcripts of the novel, or typescripts of the novel in development that would become the Barracks, or indeed in his early life, a barrack evening, as it was once known. So those archive materials are all remarkable objects in their own right, all documenting the labour of the writer, the immense craft and attention to detail of McGahern, as each work from novel to story are brought to life on the page. And again, all that archive is accessible and viewable here at the University of Galway. But how fitting it is that our hosts for tonight are the McGahern Barracks Museum in Coote Hall. My thanks to Professor Tom Inglis, to Maurice Gannon especially, and all in the lead up to and in the planning of this evening's event. So this is very much a virtual homecoming of sorts for the novel, The Barracks, back indeed to the building which gave it its name and back to the archive from where it all began. So before we begin with our very distinguished panel, who I'll introduce shortly, I'll just pass over to Tom and to Maurice, who are in the Barracks, to say a few words. Tom.
A word from our sponsor, and I mean that literally because Maurice Gannon has been the driving force in first of all, the renovation of the building, and then in establishing the exhibition and in promoting the Barracks. We have lots of great projects and plans, but the main thing is that we do depend on voluntary contributions of the committee that run the Barracks, but also we hope to get donations. And thank you very much for contributing to this, but Maurice has a word to say to you all.
Very, very briefly, good evening, everyone. As Tom has mentioned, my name is Maurice Gannon, and I'm the chairperson of the John McGahern Barracks Museum here in the beautiful Coote Hall. I'm going to come to Roscommon. Our thanks to the panel for what I'm sure will be the most interesting and engaging discussion coming up. Ladies and gentlemen, the Barracks Museum was funded by Roscommon Legal Partnership, Roscommon County Council, Creative Ireland, and local contributions, and we're most grateful for all of their support. However, as Tom has mentioned, we're a voluntary board, and we do need constant financial input in order to meet the ongoing monthly operational costs. Just to mention it once, there is a donation button on our website, mcgahernbarracks.ie, and any contribution is greatly appreciated. It just remains me to say, come and visit us in Coote Hall and the John McGahern Barracks Museum in Coote Hall sometime this year. We'll be delighted to host you and the tours. Enjoy the webinar. Thanks.
Okay, I'm just going to talk personally just for a moment, literally, because I'm sitting in the living room, the kitchen living room that McGahern spent so much time of those early years. And it is an awesome experience. And if you had said to me back in the 60s that I would be sitting here, recommending to everybody to come and visit the Barracks, I would have been astounded, because when I read the Barracks and when I read the Dark, but the Barracks, the first one, I mean, it was all of what I did not want to be. I mean, it was, Colm has used the word melancholic. I would say it's depressing. It's a depressing view of family life, of a woman dying of cancer, of an angry man who can't deal with his emotions. And it was all of what I did not want to be. I wanted to be in London or New York. I was watching American and British media, and the idea that that this said anything to me, it was ludicrous. And now, of course, it's an amazing experience to be in the place, because he says himself that everything interesting starts with one person in one place, and it started here. And I've often wondered, as I've sat here, what was going through his mind. I mean, how did this wonderful writer emerge from the readings that he did and emerge from his tentative writings in those days? And of course, that's exactly what all great writers they emerge in conditions not of their own choosing. But that's why I would encourage you, if I can be astounded by the wonderful experience of being in this room, I would encourage everybody to come and visit the Barracks. It's a special place. Over to you, Barry.
Thanks so much, Maurice. And to Tom, and I can only echo all Tom's comments. I was very fortunate to visit the Barracks at Good Hall last year, and it is truly a special place, and great to have this webinar happening this evening. So again, we're extremely fortunate to have a truly distinguished panel of speakers with us this evening, and as the saying goes, they need no introduction, I'm sure, to anyone, but I'll endeavour to do so regardless. So first of all, to introduce Colm Tóibín, is the author of 10 novels, including most recently The Magician, winner of the Rathbones Folio Prize, as well as two collections, as well as two story collections and several books of criticism. He is the Irene and Sidney B. Silverman Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University, and is, of course, currently the Laureate for Irish Fiction, appointed by the Arts Council of Ireland. 3 times shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Colm's most recent book is the book of essays, A Guest at the Feast. Niamh Campbell from Dublin was awarded the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature in 2021 for her wonderful novel, This Happy, and her second novel entitled We Were Young, published in 2022. Niamh is also a noted scholar of John McGahern, having completed a PhD on his works and published a monograph, Sacred Weather, Atmospheric Essentialism, in the work of John McGahern. Niamh lectures in creative writing at University College Dublin. Caitriona Crowe is the former head of special projects at the National Archives of Ireland. She was manager of the groundbreaking census online project, which placed the Irish 1901 and 1911 census records freely accessible online. She's the editor of the book Dublin 1911 and is a member of the Royal Irish Academy. Caitriona published a long piece in the Dublin Review in 2021 on the mother and baby home testimony and the commission of testimony by the, or a treatment of testimony by the commission, a really important piece of writing. So all three of you, to Colm, Caitriona and Niamh, you're very welcome, and thanks for joining us this evening. So if I could begin with the Barracks, it is, of course, McGahern's first published novel, not his first written novel, which we might get to shortly. That honour goes to The End or the Beginning of Love. But when the Barracks was first published in February 1963, within 2 months, it was the top-selling book in Dublin, if not in all of Ireland. It beat into second place another book by a young Irish writer whose name was Brian Friel, who did well afterwards, and his story collection, A Saucer of Larks. And it also beat out another novel into third place, and that was Ian Fleming's On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So a whole mix of books and different genres and styles, from stories to novels, and McGahern was top of the pile with the Barracks. And Colm, if I come to you first, perhaps why do you think this novel grabbed the public's attention so much at the time in 1963, and why did McGahern choose to tell this story as his first novel and not?
I think if you look at his decade, starting with the publication of Brian Moore's Lonely Passion of Judith Hearn, which is 55, and ending with Aidan Higgins' Language Go Down in 66, and including John Broderick's The Pilgrimage, his first novel, in 61, you find 4 young Irish writers, each one of them choosing a woman of their parents' generation to describe, to dramatize. And the problem is that it's hard to make a theory out of this, but it didn't happen in any other country, in the English-speaking world anyway. This didn't happen. And so Brian Moore has an explanation that there was simply so little sensibility apparent in the men of his father's generation. You could get nothing from them. You got silence. You got a sort of resentment of the world, which is I think is apparent in Brian Moore's later novels, where his father appears, or a figure like his father appears, and therefore you went to women who actually were able to express their feelings, or to talk a lot, or to in some way or other make themselves clear, not spend a life in complete concealment. But the other explanation from Aidan Higgins is a simple one, that the Language sisters, led by Imogen Language, were simply himself and his brothers in drag. And that's what he said. He simply needed to create himself and his brothers, and he couldn't work out a way of doing it. And he made them he made them women in a decaying big house. But the McGahern one is extremely interesting, of course, from a biographical point of view, but it doesn't solve the problem. The biographical one is that his mother had died of this very disease, and his mother was dead. and his father's living with his stepmother, who lived to be old. And he, as a young writer, decided that he would dramatize the death of a woman with cancer in the barracks. And it would be in some way or other a cross between his mother and his stepmother in one way, but in another way it would be a totally invented character whose life could have been close in certain ways to one of the heroines in D.H. Lawrence, who's terribly interested in culture and learning, who has a sort of interesting attitude towards life and death. And it also, of course, could be a figure out of Graham Greene, where she's so filled with doubt and her Catholicism is there. So there are a good number of literary echoes, including, of course, echoes from Tolstoy, the death of Ivan Ilyich, and of course from Joyce. When the guards talk, it's straight out of Joyce's Grace. When they say Jesus was 6 foot tall, you just think that's Joyce, that's the story of Grace. So he was using a number of literary, I think, sources, but the main source was his imagination. He began to imagine what a woman of rare and rich sensibility would be like if she were in the Midlands, in the position of being married to a figure like his father, having stepchildren, what it simply would be like. So while it's very easy to think of McGahern as an autobiographical writer, I think the figure of Elizabeth is we have to remember, is neither his mother nor his stepmother. She is an imagined figure, and this is, I think, the richness of the book, that he's able to give her an extraordinary sense of doubt and faith, and a way of suffering, a way of noticing, a way of being in the world that's I think very dense and textured.
And he does. He gives such agency and presence to Elizabeth, and he's a young man writing that story and writing that character, he himself. But as you say, he's clearly haunted by many things, including the death of his own mother. But as you say, Elizabeth is an amalgam of many things. But Caitriona, if I could come to you about, I suppose, to put some context around the Ireland of the 1950s and of the 1960s, out of which McGahern's imagination draws on this wellspring of rural Ireland. He's part of it, he grows up in it, he witnesses it in the barracks. But how does he present those real dynamics of the family, which are always at odds with the state and the church in Ireland at the time?
It wasn't just McGahern who said that each Irish family is a little independent republic, which was a fascinating insight. Colm's perfectly right that Elizabeth is a creature of his imagination with many different rivers flowing into her, as it were. But the barracks is the barracks, and it's really lovely that Tom is sitting in it tonight in the very room where I would have to assume that McGahern is thinking of when he is writing this book. The center of the household is the kitchen, where they all ate every day, where she had to engage in the typical drudgery of a married woman with children in the rural Ireland at that time, which was essentially the life lived by people in medieval Europe. So she cooks over an open fire. She's got all the various utensils that are needed to do that. A pot oven, a griddle, all of those kind of things are there, kettle. She has to go to a well for water. She and Willie make that journey in the book at one stage. And it's quite a distance. And I remember doing the same myself in County Clare when I was a child in my father's place, going to get water from the well. And you never forget the weight of a bucket of water once you've carried it for quite a distance. It stays with you forever. And I suppose one of the good things about that is that a majority of women in the world today still carry water from wells. Those of us who have wonderful water flowing out of our taps are very privileged indeed. So she's in the area pre-electricity. They have paraffin lamps, oil lamps in the house. No running water. She has to go to the well. The sewerage issue is elided slightly. We hear that there's a lavatory in the outhouses of the barracks, but we still hear about piss pots and slops being taken down to the ash pit in the morning. So all of that had to be dealt with. She has to wash everything by hand. Food is limited but good. People living in the country were always much better off than their urban counterparts, particularly poor people. The child mortality levels in the cities at this time and before and after, I'm taking the timescale as the 1950s, since we know that McGahern lived in those barracks from 1944 to 1953. So that's the sort of memory that he's operating off. That's not taking too much of an advantage. So there's all of that stuff yet to come. Leitrim gets electricity much later, as you would expect, than most other places. The food they have would be, they grow their own potatoes and other vegetables. They have fruit. she has a lovely moment where she goes out to pick blackcurrants when she's come back from the hospital. She's still sick and she has an afternoon to kill. She goes and picks blackcurrants and makes jam for the children. She knows that's going to please them. And we actually more or less get the recipe for blackcurrant jam, which is always a nice byproduct of a piece of fiction to get a recipe for nothing out of it. They have a turkey for Christmas, but other than that, it's bacon. Pig is killed once a year by all the families around. It's not a pleasant experience, I can tell you. Pigs really scream when they're being killed, and you have to think about it. So there's a lot of bacon, there's rashers, black pudding, all of that sort of stuff, eggs from their own hens. But all of this is good fresh food. Their own potatoes, there's a big deal about planting the potatoes and then harvesting them later. They're in cities, people did not have access to that kind of fresh food. So the child mortality levels are much lower in the countryside. But we're here at a moment, I suppose, in the early 50s, I would say, just judging from all of what I've just talked about, when Ireland is still emerging from its emergency, from its Second World War isolation, because of course we were neutral during World War II, and that was held against us by the United States and the UK in particular. What costs money? Health costs money. You still have to pay money to go to hospital. You still have to pay money to go to the GP if you don't wish to go to the dispensary, which is free. There is a big deal made by Regan about the money that it costs to deal with Elizabeth's illness and then her death. So finances, difficult. Guards did not earn huge salaries, even though he's a sergeant. He wouldn't have had a lot of money. When he retires, he's going to have a very small pension at that stage. Garda pensions weren't revised upwards until the end of the 1950s. There's economic stagnation everywhere in the country at this stage, which doesn't start to dissipate until T.K. Whitaker introduces the first program for economic expansion in 1959 at the end of the decade. The Catholic Church is all powerful, rules the roost in every respect. We meet the parish priest, who's a characteristically entitled character, who tries to get Elizabeth to join the Legion of Mary, which very bravely she refuses to do, and nothing is going to budge her. And he is very annoyed about this and wants to insist that she should. There's a lot of exploration in the novel of Catholic doctrine and ritual, which were things that mattered to McGahern as things to observe and think about, towards the end of the book in particular. And interestingly, there are 3 references in the novel to Catholic institutions for women and children. Mrs. Casey tells that she has no children, and she tells Elizabeth that she had proposed to her husband that they adopt a child from the home. He said, no, that child would have bad blood or wild blood on its mother or father's side. There's another reference to Regan winning the contract for his turf business to supply the fuel needs of the laundry run by the Sisters of Mercy, clearly a reference to a Magdalen laundry where women were engaged in slave labor. And lastly, there's a sad and poignant reference to homeboys, children who were boarded out, usually from industrial schools, sometimes from mother and baby homes, to farmers. Some of them were lucky and found caring families, and others were viciously exploited, and how few cars would follow their funerals. So all these things are there to be got. The image of family life, to answer the question that you actually asked me, Barry, is very tender. You know, Elizabeth loves these children and they seem to love her. She's conscious of the fact that she's not their blood mother and that has an effect on things in a certain way. Regan is angry and intemperate, but as the novel progresses, and I haven't read this book for 40 years, the last time I read it, I came away with an impression that I held in my mind of Regan being an absolute monster. But in fact, he's not. He's quite tender and sweet to her in all kinds of ways. And you can see that he is really up against it with the intolerable Superintendent Quirk, who deserves the bollocking he gives him at the very end of the book when he's walking out the door to resign. But he definitely cares about Elizabeth. There's a lot made in the book which I find a little contradictory about how they never really know each other and don't understand each other and how that sort of worked out, and that they're ashamed of intimacy. I'm not sure what McGahern is getting at with that. They seem to me to have not a bad relationship. And he seems to be very attached to her and sad that she's dying, and very sad when she actually dies. But family life is presented as the usual stuff. Kids go to school, they come home for the dinner in the middle of the day. She helps them. The first paragraph in the book, and I'll finish with this, is absolutely beautiful, where we have her darning a sock by the fire and a description of the room as the light fades and the Sacred Heart lamp burning on the wall. And it's like a de la Tour painting with their faces, the three children around her sitting at the fire. And it gives us an entire environment in one paragraph, which is really part of the skill of Mr. McGahern.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Caitriona. And many things to pick up there during the course of the discussion, in particular about that reference to the homeboys, which comes up very late in the book, and about the funeral. But if I could come to Niamh, and drawing on one of your last points, Caitriona, about the skill of McGahern, you know, this is still a young man, a young writer who was published this book at the time. And Niamh, could you maybe comment on, with both your McGahern scholar hat and that of a writer yourself, I mean, the skill and the craft that he succeeded in pulling the complexities of all these things together, all the literary allusions that Colm mentioned, the social context that Caitriona mentioned, and how do you think he succeeds in drawing all those things together and producing the novel that is The Barracks and all its various components?
Well, I suppose it's in some ways like the young Joyce writing Dubliners and having this incredible capacity to do layers of references, literary references, observations of character, really merciless realism. But I think with Barracks and with McGahern, there's so much more compassion in the way that he depicts everything. So the secret element to it is just how much attention he's paid to women like Elizabeth, obviously, in order to construct this character so persuasively. I think reading it as a woman is especially illuminating, and I always think about that when reading McGahern, because it's not always the case. But Elizabeth is so convincing and so accurate a depiction of a female experience of the world, that to have this written by a man in his 20s is really astonishing. Now, I suspect that on one level, McGahern was a very ambitious writer. I mean, the fact that, as we were just discussing, he pulls his own first novel back and, you know, makes this his first novel instead. He's got his eye on the prize, or he's a perfectionist around what he's doing. So there's enormous care gone into the composition of the novel. There's no one ideological or polemical point being made, even though it's depicting this world that I think he had unresolved feelings about at the time. And I do agree with Caitriona that Regan is a very tender character and very realistic, believable, familiar character as well. I find that Regan reminds me of older men in my own family more than old Mahoney does, or anything like that. He's not a horror. He's more temperate. So I suppose a writer always wants to know how to do this kind of galaxy brain observation down into one small space that is so observed with so much complete tenderness. I think it's probably quite Chekhovian, really, in that regard. It's kind of, there's a love for the subject as well as a desire to depict it honestly. Maybe it's something to do with that.
And again, that idea of kind of zooming in onto something very ordinary and very plain, and yet drawing entire sections and paragraphs and pages out of that one single image. Even the opening lines, I think you mentioned, maybe Caitriona, Mrs. Regan darned an old woolen sock as the February night came on, her head bent, catching the threads on the needle by the light of the fire, the daylight gone without her noticing. And in the space of a couple of lines, you're sitting next to her already, and perhaps Colm or anyone indeed in the panel, in the sense of how McGahern opens the book and how he presents the character or presents this peaceful scene. In a sense, it's about, yes, a rural life, but also about a changing sense of domestic life and a changing Ireland that's coming around them. But in one of the shortest lines in the novel, what was her life? Elizabeth is kind of searching for that, or yearning for that. And is that what John was perhaps trying to answer in the book? What was her life?
It's so interesting to be reminded that it begins Mrs. Regan and then becomes Elizabeth, because Mrs. Regan is a little note of privacy or formality, and clearly that she's the protagonist, so this is coming through her in some way. It's outside her and then goes inside. That switch seems significant in some way to the question you're asking there about what was her life. That observance of someone who to the writer is a remote figure. So if we're looking at mother and stepmother and an invented third character, and then to move into this intimate, imagining what it's like from her perspective, it's an act of imaginative generosity that I think is one of the great skills of this book as well. That's just jumping in there. I'd forgotten that that's how it opens with Mrs. Regan and not Elizabeth. It's just something very beautiful about that.
There is,
Yeah.
It's also, Elizabeth has a past. There's very little about emigration. Is a huge thing at this point in time, the 1950s. 412,000 people left Ireland between 1951 and 1961, the biggest number since the 1880s. There's very little about emigration as a thing that affects this family, except one reference when they're going to Dublin on the train. Regan points out, better that we're getting this train in the morning rather than the 3:25 this afternoon. That would be full of people, packed like cattle, going to get the boat train. And of course, Elizabeth herself is a returned emigrant. She went to London, she worked in a hospital, and we get quite a lot of detail about her life there and her affair with Michael Halliday, who I found one of the most irritating people I've ever come across. Bloody irritating, Michael Halliday. I mean, I'm sorry for him, forgive me, but what the hell is all this living and dying for? Anyway, we do get all that, and she's coming back with she is different. She's slightly isolated by her own wish from the other women in the town and in the barracks. The barracks wives, she gets on well enough with Mrs. Casey because she needs her for various purposes. But she's often dying to get away from people when they stop to chat to her in the street. She doesn't have close friends. That's not part of her thing. The family is her life, being surrounded by these children and this man. That's what matters to her. Nothing else, really much. She's very interesting when she's waiting at the doctor's, waiting for her first consultation, where she's going to be told she has to go and get tests in the hospital. She's looking at the other people in the waiting room, and suddenly we have a fabulous rant through her eyes about the ex-garrison town poor who are all around her with their names, the old garrison names like Gatesby and Brown, and how they're lying idle around the street or being part-time postmen or labourers seasonally, etc. It's a very interesting moment. And then she says, whether this is her or not, it's actually McGahern, it's not her, saying that they have recently been Monty's rats and been and before that in the Dardanelles, that these are people who fought for the British Army, who have recently been fighting in Europe against fascism. And here they are now lying around the town and subject to some scorn. And it's an interesting, McGahern is always very, very good on social differences and who can look down on who. And he despises it in many ways, that sort of small town snobbery. But this is definitely part of it. And it's an interesting moment to see that arising as an issue.
I think just to come back to what Caitriona said about those opening pages, which are very powerful, as she says, that McGahern was fascinated by an idea which he called the image, that no matter what image you chose, it had to do more work than merely just be a detail in the middle of things that would create verisimilitude. So that every single sentence in that opening page has something to do with light. The word light itself is 6 times in one page. And what is going on is actually a battle, as it were. They talk about their fear of the night, a battle between the light that remains, the light that they are using, the firelight, the Sacred Heart lamp, the light they light, and the night coming down. And each detail seems absolutely right. In other words, all the domestic details are in place. It is, as Caitriona says, like a painting. But that battle between darkness and light is what then begins to nourish the novel. So what Elizabeth is facing is her own battle between darkness and light. And McGahern gives her battle, especially later on in the book, where she would do something ordinary in the house or something would occur, and then there would be a paragraph. And the paragraph could move very poetically sometimes into ideas about fear and religion and death and solitude. For example, there's another page, if light is mentioned 6 times on one page, there's another page in which the word nothing is 6 times. It's just nothing, nothing, nothing. I mean, it's like a drum beat, and he's not afraid of those sort of repetitions. And then you get an extraordinary passage. This is just one example. That was the way, and mostly the way, most of them went that way, and she'd have to lie down that way too. She was no different. That was the terrible thing. She was no more than a fragment of the same squalid generality. And those sentences come from a sort of funny modernism, which makes its way into Beckett. I'm not suggesting they're influenced by Beckett, but I'm suggesting that idea of a paragraph every so often that would spiritualize her, having domesticated her, you know, and having given her a past, the need then is to move inwards. If you look at John Broderick's novel, The Pilgrimage, from 2 years earlier, with Julia Glynn, he fails to move Julia Glynn inwards. It's all outward. It's all, you know, it's all shopping, a lot of sex, and a lot of gossip. But her spiritual life doesn't exist. This is all about these paragraphs are all about moving inwards, and of course, moving inwards in the spirit of the age. You know, he's not just an Irish novelist in the 1950s, late 50s, as he's writing this, or he's read a great deal. He's been in London, and he's got friends who are reading deeply. And of course, the issue is existentialism. The issue is, how do we deal with our own despair? What do we do in the face of death? How should we live? And these are the issues that he begins to dramatize as the novel goes on, especially as the novel comes to the end, where he gives her this extraordinary amount of, I suppose, there are moments where she becomes a vehicle for certain ideas about despair and ritual and light and dark. Other times she isn't the vehicle, but at the time, French writers were writing novels in which characters were entirely vehicles for ideas. So this is not so strange. But there are moments, I think Caitriona's absolutely right, that Michael Halliday, I think McGahern learned very quickly from Michael Halliday not to go there again. Don't try and write English dialogue. You know, there's a moment late in the book where he has a fellow who's drunk outside the church on Christmas night, and he says to the guard, "Sugar off." And I said, "Look, I hadn't heard anyone sugar off." It's just a brilliant, you know, tiny detail. But Michael Halliday's speech has no flavor. It has no texture. It seems to come from nowhere. And also what he's saying seems wooden and strange. And it's interesting, I don't think McGahern wanted to go there again. And it's also interesting that there are times when Elizabeth, for example, when she seems to be familiar with Byron, with you know, lines from Lord Byron's Don Juan, or where she seems to have thoughts that don't seem to me to come directly from her own being or her own presence in the novel. But most of the time, he's pushing her as far as he can go to really live a spiritual life in the Irish Midlands, to take in the landscape in a spiritual way, to look from the window, to see colours, and to see her own death in a way which is very serious and serious-minded. And so it isn't merely a novel about domestic life in the Midlands or a woman dying. It's an effort to write a novel, almost a novel of ideas, being very, very careful with the ideas, making the ideas subtle and nuanced as he can. But the figure of Halliday, no, he don't write. You know, it's the same as English writers trying to write Irish dialogue. Can't be done.
But he is the route to books for her. That's his use. And you know, if we could have done that some other way, it would have been good. But that's how she gets to read her Byron and her Shelley and all the rest of it. He gives her books to read in London, and he knows she'd appreciate them. So otherwise, it is a curious thing that she does have these fragments of interesting poetry floating around in her mind.
But can I just go back?
Sorry, Tom. Go ahead. Go ahead, Tom.
No, I'm interested in the rehabilitation of Regan. I mean, because I saw him as an emotionally unfulfilled and unable to communicate. And yet it from what you've been saying, that there is a sense of whereby he does really care, he does really love, and so therefore is he, you know, kind of the more sympathetic of the male characters that emerge in the later books, and that there is something, if you like, humane about him, but that's also true for me. What it was that this was an insight into family life, into family relationships. And there were different characters are revealed. We get to understand Elizabeth most of all, but we also get to understand the dynamics. And I still think that one of the things that comes out is that they live in fear of Regan, that there is this dimension that it seems to me was revealed about family life. We got to see the seedier side in the dark, but in the Barracks, there is a tension that's there, and it's all about how he will react, and that's in other McGahern characters. So it's that I completely agree with all the wonderful insights that you've brought. But for me, when I read it and when I still read it, it's the dynamics of family life and of what is said and not said. You know, the underlying currents that are there. and that they, and right from the beginning, it's all about Regan coming home. I mean, it's the male character riding back, into the barracks with the castle. And that's I will now pass on.
Great. No, Tom, again, there's so much in that about, yes, the presence of the father, the figure arriving home, the policeman arriving home, and the children saying they heard their father's tires first. And that, again, it was a sense of the absurdity that's in the novel as well, that these patrols of the imagination, the taskless, the endless tasks that don't really do anything, of the rural policeman, of which Regan and the other guards are. I know one section early on in the novel where it talks about this returning father figure on the bicycle. It says, a terrible night to be cycling about like a fool. And then that's part of the patrols of the imagination. So within the melancholy of the book, within the darkness of the book, there's still this almost Beckett-like, again, nihilism that you mentioned, Colm, the absurdity of this phony war, I think I called it, against crime, which didn't exist.
Yeah, I think the French who loved this book, I mean, it became a very important book in France, might have seen the behavior of the policemen in the book as a sort of metaphor for sort of futility. But in fact, and Irish readers would see it as, yes, that is what the cops did. That's what the third policeman, I mean, that's what they did. They went around their bicycles, making sure you had a lamp on your bike, or there's a wonderful scene where he tries to clear out the pub and a fellow tries to bribe him. And, that futility was something we all sort of, anyone who was around then actually knows about. But of course, bringing that futility, that they go out every day on their bicycles and it doesn't matter whether they do or not. That they come home and they're meant to write it all up in a book and it doesn't matter whether they do or not. So here are 4 of them locked into this futile work. And of course, McGahern has no problem with the word futility. It became impossible later to use the word futility in a novel. But here it is, and the word meaningless, and the word the nowhere of herself, and living within the dead husk of herself. And so that he's this image of futility becomes, first of all, a real image. In other words, it is what the cops were doing. What they were doing was futile. And then it has resonance. And then it starts to move into the whole idea of every day being ordered in this futile way, and night coming down again, the next day coming down again, and the sort of slow, strange, and sometimes futile ritual of time moving. So again, he manages to get something that is ordinary, domestic, and known to everyone, which is how little work the cops had to do in Leitrim, where there was no murder, and where there were no, there really was no big robberies going on, and make this into not a metaphor, but to give it enough resonance so that it made its way slowly into the body of the book, and the body of the book became more philosophical than it did, for example, a realist novel. Just to try and describe what, I mean, Caitriona's absolutely right that McGahern never got things wrong about those details. The whole business of just putting them in slowly, the Magdalen laundry, where the laundry was, how the laundry got its turf, that those sort of things he never got wrong. And I think by not getting them wrong, it gave him permission to use images such as the ordinary business of night coming down in a house without electricity, or the guards going out on their bicycles, and make all that actually matter more than it would suggest. All the time, everything being suggestive and all about resonance, each image moving slowly towards a further inner image, which was, I think, more important to him, which was really a young man's book written in the late 50s about futility, existentialism, and what life and death meant. And he wanted to do this in a way in a setting where such thoughts, he felt, had never really been worked out before, which was the Irish Midlands.
Brilliant, Colm, absolutely brilliant. The counterpoint, though, to the futility of what the guards are up to every day or not up to every day. And that is the absolute love of nature that suffuses this book and everything else he ever wrote. He has an absolutely flawless appreciation of the Irish countryside. And there are several other, I compared the first paragraph to a de la Tour. There are various other passages in this book which are like a scene from Peter Bruegel, again, a timeless vision of a rural landscape with the people from the saws sawing in the trees down from work in the evening. The noise of work stops, they can hear the birds singing, the river is floating by. He describes the river as black very often. and the white fields with hoarfrost on them going down to the river, ash trees, beech trees. He knows nature inside out. And he gets these moments. And also the thing that compensates, I think, for the futility of the job that he has and the fact that his ambitions have been so savagely thwarted. This guy led a flying column during the War of Independence. He gave orders. He was 19 years old. He gave orders to other people beneath him. And here he is now having to listen to this insufferable, pompous superintendent. That drives him nuts. But what compensates a little is the round of nature, the planting of vegetables in the spring, the harvesting of them later, the turf. Mind you, he puts his kids out to work on the bog. And I remember footing turf for one day in my life, and I would never do it again. It's really hard work. And Elizabeth does argue with him about that and say, this is too much for them. They should be at home doing their own work instead of being packed off to the bog. And the patrols of the imagination are the trips to the bog. In other words, he is making plans to get himself out of this hellhole that he regards as beneath his dignity and buy a small farm with the money he's making from selling turf and various other enterprises he's imagining at this point. That doesn't work out because Elizabeth dies and it costs money and all the money he saved up is gone. But I think there are compensations. Everything you say, Colm, is absolutely right and brilliant about the metaphor of futility being encapsulated in the daily round of police. But I think there are compensations. And I don't think McGahern can ever resist the seduction of nature. I think it's just part of his way of seeing the world that he loved his cottage by the lake. He adored going out for a walk every day with his dog and just looking at what was going on around him. And I think he had that, and memoir particularly is so full of love of that part of the countryside and what it's like in the spring and the summer in particular. So I think we get that too. We're grateful for it.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, to pick up on something both of you have mentioned there, Colm and Caitriona, reminds me of a line that John scribbled in the archive on an early draft, and it was that Elizabeth experiences the beauty of things about her with increasing violence. And again, that dichotomy, that contrast between beauty and violence is there, the futility, but the landscape as well, to pick up on what you were saying there, maybe to bring this over to you, Niamh, as well, is that again, on that early draft, A Barrack Evening, he focuses in on one image, and it's of a vase of flowers on the window that have wilted since the winter previously. And he's toying with this image. He's not quite getting happy with it. And it's about Elizabeth's own mother dying. So there's other people, this sense of, as you said earlier, giving Elizabeth a past, but bringing the metaphor out through nature and landscape. It's something that's in the book, but also in perhaps these other writings as well later on.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the way he writes to nature is quite ecstatic and, as to use Colm's words, spiritualized. Memoir makes quite clear, I think, that I would find it difficult to ascribe a message or a meaning or a historical context to it because it just seems like love and almost pre-verbal or like a dream state that he's accessing these images in, and possibly because a lot of them are very heavily imprinted on his memory in an almost involuntary way. And I think we all probably understand that idea of violence instinctively, but it's difficult to explain that theoretically. But you do know there's a level of reality that goes into surreal, like an altered state of mind, like an out-of-body experience. If you can, which is in kind of some ways probably traumatized as well. I would think there's trauma running through McGahern's way of seeing the world, not as a theme always, but as a conditioning color palette based on the other writings and on biography. So this feeds into Elizabeth's experience of it because, of course, she's dying. She's sliding towards the end of her life. You've got the battle of light and darkness. It figures that these things would start to take on hallucinatory, frightening quality, the beauty passing into, and it does it in memoir as well. There are times in memoir where it's either looks like it's confected, the nature is that beautiful, or it's sublime in a way that is quite frightening to experience. And even the closing image of walking through the laneway with his mother and wanting nothing to impinge upon her there's something almost it's sublime in the most original sense of the term about that.
I think that idea of dream, Niamh, is really great. I hadn't thought of that as the idea that this book itself is a dream. In other words, that someone who's been through a really traumatic experience of losing his mother and of having to go and live in a certain other building, which he associates with cruelty and menace, has a dream, which is a novel, where he dreams that the death took place a second time in the second house, and that he had to go through it all again. And that his job now is to imagine that dream in full. And it's to, he's both absent and present. You know, there were two brothers, so that really could easily be his younger brother. He could make himself totally absent, as he does with Luke in Amongst Women. But the first mother is totally absent, as she will be in Amongst Women. He can't write it, but he can dream it. And this book is the dream of it. And so if you were a psychoanalyst, you could really have a field day with this idea that the power of this novel comes from the power of the dream, from the need for the dream, for the fact that the dream mattered and mattered intensely to him. The idea of the absence of the first house, the second house, so that what he's doing is he's transposing, but he's not really transposing. He's re-seeing the whole thing, the trauma coming the second time, trying to control the trauma the second time. And that in a way is one of the keys, I think, to fiction itself, that so much of fiction comes out of a sort of dark, strange dream that then becomes more solid as you put it into sentences.
That sense of trauma you mentioned.
Hardly at all of the first wife's death in the barracks. It's made clear to us early that has happened. And after that, there's nothing. We don't get her thinking about it, wondering what she was like. We don't get Regan meditating on it in any way. We don't get the children. You're quite right. That is definitely an indication of serious trauma, that he cannot write about this thing which, when he was 9 years old, transformed his life really seriously. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. I'll just ask people to be readying questions in the meantime for our panel in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. But perhaps one or two more questions for our panel. And one is to come back to an image you mentioned early on, Caitriona, and that is the funeral of Elizabeth. And in a sense, it's a rather cruel image of how rural Ireland gives credence to a person's life. And again, at the start, it's such a peaceful image of Elizabeth darning the sock, but we see her death being measured by how many cars are behind her coffin. I think 33 is the number he mentions. The record is 186 cars, but again, as little as 5 for a funeral of a lowly homeboy, as you mentioned, again, someone fostered out or boarded out from a mother and baby home out into a rural domestic, or into a rural family as domestic labor. But that sense of the ritual of the funeral, McGahern wrote a short story he wrote, it was called The Country Funeral. We see scenes of bodies being waked in his later novels. And again, feel free to jump in here as well, Tom. I know that idea of the funeral in Irish country life is something you're interested in as well. But this is what we end with, but we don't see the aftermath. After, how does the family really function without Elizabeth? And that sense of how death is marked in rural Ireland and marked in the novel as the end. If anyone wants to maybe try and respond on that, the image of the funeral in his books.
It is fascinating, though, that he wants to give Regan his day out. No, he's not interested in telling us about how the children are surviving the death of a second mother. He wants that big scene, and by God, it's beautifully written, where he comes down late with his tunic unbuttoned, unshaven, and gives it to Superintendent Quirk. And it's a funny way to finish the whole thing up, but it's kind of inevitable that we're moving towards this. Regan's trajectory throughout the novel is marked by this relationship, which is so troubling to him and irritates him so much, and is responsible for a lot of his volatility and unpredictability, and arriving not knowing what he's going to be like when he comes home in the evening. If he met Superintendent Quirk, he's going to be in very bad form. If he didn't, he might be okay. So he decides not to deal with that, to deal with Elizabeth's death, to deal with the effect on the children, or even the effect on Regan per se. He gives us something else altogether. But the whole business of funerals and social status, there can't have been 186 cars in Leitrim in the early. I mean, that's the one thing he must have got wrong. That just couldn't be true. Jesus. But it's.
I just think that's you're right about that link between funerals and the public image, and that there is something in Regan that is in McGahern's father, which is this craving for respect and deference, and that the way in which you do this public display of having the grand funeral or being known for, and I still, there's evidence of it still, to my mind, in rural Ireland today, that there is still a huge concern about status and funerals, and that McGahern's father himself, wanting, as it comes out in the memoir, wanting to have a high mass, and being persuaded, no, just have an ordinary mass, but that convolution, or so that conflation of status and funerals is remarkable. But just one thing I wanted to pick up on, and that is when Elizabeth thinks back about her relationship with Halliday, there is an element in that of which that was only when she really had an enjoyable, if you dare like say, kind of almost hedonistic type experience of life, and that it comes back, and she's caught in this, the mundane realities of domestic chores, and she thinks back and says, "Ooh, wow, was that an experience of life?" And that it was that brief, and with that awful man, as you say, Caitriona Halliday, but it was still, if you like, it lingers in her mind as being fulfilling. And it seems to me that that's a trope that comes back to McGahern, that there's a world in rural Ireland in which there is no, it's about surviving, it's about getting things done, whereas the real life is lived in Dublin, or it's lived in London, where pleasures are distilled and enjoyed, and that maybe that's a trope that he uses in other novels.
I think there's a wonderful account of the sergeant of Regan trying to go to Dublin and trying to go for a walk in the city on his own. And I think it's one moment where McGahern just moves one sentence beyond what's possible, where he writes about it, which I think is anyone who's come up from, say, from anywhere in the country to Dublin, talking about loitering about the streets with the fascination of country people for faces, the thousands of faces that poured past, not only that he knew, strange to understand, they were all subdued and absorbed in their own lives. And then the sentence I would cut, but I mean, I love it being here, is that such constant friction of bodies, this is Regan thinking, didn't cause them to strangle each other or copulate en masse. I think,
You're right.
Well, this is Regan. Does he really think, as he's sitting there? The strangle, yeah, the copulate, I don't know. But anyway, I simply love moments like that where you feel the author has just simply appeared, his head above the parapet, and say, "Hi, there's also me. I'm here too." But I love the idea of the sort of sheer difference of Dublin, and of course, as Tom says, that not that London is exotic, but it gave her life. All the rich life that she's brought back was life that she got as from this figure of Michael Halliday that none of us likes.
And the other thing that it allows McGahern to do is to tell us that Elizabeth was beautiful. She was a beautiful woman. Halliday keeps telling her so. We wouldn't know that otherwise, because it's certainly not apparent in the rest of the book. So she is fading as we meet her. But when she was young in London, she was very beautiful. And that matters in terms of how the reader sees her. So she gets two things from Halliday: compliments about her looks and an introduction to great literature. That's pretty cool, even if she had to other things from him. It's not a bad outcome, I would say.
Interesting that McGahern also said that Elizabeth Regan, with the exception of one other character, was his favourite in all her books, and that the character was the character of the editor and the pornographer, which is also a humorous figure in many ways. But he did have great love for her as a character, I think. And she's I mean, enduring. This might be a lead into a final question for all the panel, that Elizabeth is one of the great enduring legacies of that book, one of the great characters. But 60 years later, be it someone returning to the book or someone discovering it today for the first time, what is the great legacy of the Barracks as a novel, and what might people discover there for the first time?
I think the timelessness and the fact that he got the time right, as Caitriona points out, and then moves in to areas of timelessness, of timeless debate about the eternal subjects. And I think anyone reading could not say, well, this novel is not for me because the time has passed. No, it hasn't. Watch remark. I mean, there are so many times in the book where when they say, for example, that nobody can find anyone else to die their death for them, that those sort of, I suppose, those sort of musings in the book as it comes to the end are remarkable. And so the book's timelessness and its time. So it's our Madame Bovary.
Great. Niamh or Caitriona, anything on that? What can we quantify legacies of the book?
Colm has put it so beautifully. I think that is why reading it, as I first read it when I was a teenager and reading it now in my 30s, it's more and more unnervingly accurate in its look at the human condition and so on. But also just on a craft level, I was going to say about the conversation when the policemen are talking, which is obviously a nod to Grace, but also a brilliant study in people talking about nothing for a period of time, done with a lot of humor, and there's sort of irony, but it's also compassionate and believable. And I was teaching that scene a couple of months ago, and my students, all being quite young, really finding it very hard to tolerate that scene. And I was kind of trying to explain that your frustration is exactly the point. It's a study of people who are trapped in one place and trying to one-up this one-upmanship. Just in terms of like betraying the inner life of a lot of characters in one room at one moment in time. It's a great craft study. So it's really useful for writers to learn from on a lot of levels.
I think just to agree with Colm that Elizabeth herself is a sort of shining character that remains in the mind, beautifully drawn, suffused with all of the importance that McGahern wished to give her. And he did that, I think, coming directly, as we've been talking about earlier, Niamh's idea of dream and trauma, from his love for his mother, which we know all about. And he suffused her with that kind of emotion, which is very hard to do. And that's what makes the book live. You never, ever forget Elizabeth Reed.
Very true, very true. Before we wrap up, there are some comments and questions here in the chat. One very interesting one stating about McGahern's own death notice in the Irish Times in March 1996 or 2006, perhaps. It detailed all the towns and funerals that will pass through on the way to Houlihan. So again, the sense of how many were turning out to see the hearse going by is a fitting one. But a question here to all on the panel, all and any on the panel: do you always read with such attention to and awareness of the significance of even apparently minor details of words or of settings? And so how do we do that as readers and keep that awareness?
Well, I'm the imposter here because I'm just here to tell you about social history. There are two literary critics with me. They must do that all their job. I don't have to.
I'm just an idiot. I mean, I just come to the line where the guy is urinating outside the church, and it's Christmas Eve, and the two guards come along, and the fellow who's the perpetrator just says, "Sugar off home out of David yourself and mind your own business." And I literally critic no, I just get nothing but pleasure out of sugar off home out of David yourself. I just think sugar off home. I don't know why, just gave me such pleasure. So those sort of details are a funny part of the reading process, where the literary critic decides to just say, go away, go away. Just listen to sugar off away home out of that tune. I think maybe that is what fiction is made up of. Tiny little things like that just startle you, make you laugh or surprise you.
Yeah. There's great letters in the archive here, and of course Frank Shovlin has edited the wondrous book, The Letters of John McGahern, which is an incredible tome. In the archive, we've received the Letters to John, which is a very different collection of letters, and in that are letters to Elizabeth Schnack, John's German translator, and she sent him a list of words that she couldn't make head nor tail of, trying to translate them, words like jig acting and all sorts of other things that she couldn't translate. But when she translated the Barracks into German in the 1970s, the name was changed from the Barracks to the Police Kitchen, which is a very interesting way of rephrasing or reframing the place of the book and the place of the action. So again, all these things from the archive here in Galway, I think, give great credence and a great foundation to all the brilliant comments made by the very distinguished panel this evening. There's a comment here, I'll read the last bit of it in the chat. Was someone reading John's works, and it began an enduring love of John McGahern's works and special memories of visiting the great man himself in his lakeside home in Leitrim. So a lovely thought and a lovely image to conclude as we're live here in Galway, but also at the Barracks itself in Coote Hall. So a wonderful way to mark the 60th anniversary of the novel, of the Barracks, celebrating John's works. So if I can just add a sincere thank you to our 3 wonderful panelists this evening, to Colm Tóibín, to Caitriona Crowe, and to Niamh Campbell. And of course, thanks again to Tom Inglis and Maurice Gannon at the Barracks, not just for all the work they do in opening that museum and keeping it open and sharing it with everyone, but on hosting this webinar series, of which there has been many previous, which are all recorded and online on the Barracks website. And I'm sure more to come in the series. And perhaps a final note that might tempt you all to Coote Hall is that later in the summer, we'll have an exhibition from the Barracks archives here at Galway, up at Coote Hall, which will be a real homecoming, a physical homecoming, to bring some of those archival materials back to the Barracks. So I think I might wrap up tonight's proceedings on that note, just to thank our panel once again, and looking forward to the next webinar series from the Barracks. So again, thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you.